The sixth chapter of John's Gospel that we are reading right now during the Mass the past couple of weeks, and we finish with it next week. I think after the story of the Nativity, the Christmas story in the Gospels, and then obviously the story of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection at the end of the Gospels, I think as Catholics, the sixth chapter of John is probably the most important part of the Gospels for us. It's called the Bread of Life Discourse sometimes by people. It's Jesus continually talking throughout the sixth chapter of John, seemingly 1,000 times, saying, I am the bread of life. If you don't eat the bread of life, you don't inherit eternal life. I am the bread of life. It is my true flesh. It's my true blood. He says it over and over and over again. In fact, as we see next week, it's so difficult for some people that they stop following Jesus and they leave Him. But this is the part of the gospel that we as Catholics point to when we talk about the Eucharist. And there's approaching 50,000 denominations of Christians around the world. People with different beliefs, different faith structures, almost 50,000. And this is probably the one thing that really sets us apart from all of the other faiths in the world, that we believe in the Eucharist that Christ is truly present, that the bread and wine that we place on the altar becomes Christ's real body, His real blood, His real soul, His real divinity, and then it stays that way as we consume it. We store it in the tabernacle, we store Him in the tabernacle, His true presence in the tabernacle, and that bread and wine is permanently changed. That is a uniquely Catholic idea, and one that is at the very center of what we believe. So in order to kind of talk about that today, I have to first introduce something. This is actually, it's a book that I actually wrote. Now, before you think, wow, that's impressive, I mean, Charlie Sheen wrote a book, so it can't be that hard. Hitler did it, so it's not a big, especially in the era now where you can self-publish and you can, Ted Kaczynski could send off his manuscript and get it published if he wanted. It's become a lot easier. The reason I wrote this is it's the stories of things that happened to me in my life that led to me becoming a priest. And the reason that I did that was on the night before I was ordained, I gave a copy of each of the book to each of my family and my close friends, and just said, here's how it happened. Especially if you knew me in high school as a friend or a family member, or in college, you would really be curious, how in the world could this possibly have happened? That John Hollowell is now getting ordained to the priesthood. And it's just the stories and things that led to that. I ended up printing up a couple of more for the high school kids that I taught. I offered them a free copy if they wanted it, because not that there's really anything that earth-shattering in here. Pretty much probably everything in here had already been said, except my own personal stories. But I think a lot of times people are a lot more likely to things when they're from someone that they know. And so whereas a lot of my high school kids probably wouldn't have read any of these types of things if someone else had said it, they might have, some of them wanted, would read it if it was for me. So anyways, I have a few extra copies still. I tried to give them all away and no one would take them after a while. So if you like a copy, I have about I think 30 or so left, and just ask for a donation to the church here in Brazil. I'm not making anything off of it, and I'll donate any of that right back, obviously, to the church. But this isn't a sales pitch. That's not what it's about. The main reason that I wanted to bring that up is because the key chapter for me is the Eucharist, and how it changed my life, how understanding what is really on the altar during the Mass, during the Eucharistic prayer, how that changed my life. And I think I went to Catholic school my entire, grade school, and then on into high school, and even through college. I went to Mass every Sunday, but I don't think it was probably until my mid-20s that it finally, for some reason, sunk in that we think that the bread and wine on the altar becomes Jesus Christ, becomes His true presence. I don't know, maybe I wasn't taught it, or maybe I did and I wasn't paying attention, but for whatever reason, that totally changed my life. It changed how I came to Mass. No longer was I running in and trying to make it by the gospel. I would come early. And no longer was I, just wearing shorts and flip-flops. I decided I would try and actually dress up a little bit for Mass and wear something a little nicer than my normal street clothes. No longer did I just run out of Mass as soon as Mass was over. I stuck around for a few minutes. I felt it working on me, and it changed my life. And so it's a big chapter in my book to my family and friends. And what I did at the beginning of each of the chapters in my little book here is I put a quote from someone that was, a famous person, so that if what I said was boring or bad, then they would at least get something good out of the chapter if they read it. So I think at most of the chapters I had at most 2 quotes, from someone else. But what I decided to do on the Eucharist, and this is the whole point, I'm getting somewhere, I promise. The chapter on the Eucharist, instead of putting 1 or 2 quotes, I put about 25. And the reason I did that was because I have some family and friends who aren't Catholic and who don't share the belief that we have in the Eucharist. And I wanted to sort of illustrate or demonstrate to them a very important point. And what I did was, there's the first quote I put in here is actually from a guy named Mike Aquilina, who wrote a book on the early church fathers. Now, these are the guys that took the faith directly from the apostles. They're the next generation, right after the apostles, and they sort of, the first generation, the second generation of the church. We're talking 100, the year 100, 200s, 300s, St. Augustine, St. Irenaeus, all these guys who took the faith and sort of from the apostles, took the baton from the apostles and kept going. And he says a very important thing in the introduction to his book about the church fathers. He says that in order to dismiss the early witness of today's doctrines, such as the real presence of the Eucharist, if you want to dismiss the doctrines that the church teaches on things like the real presence of Christ, he says, then you have to go back. Protestant scholars, he says, must pick a very early date when they claim the life of the church went wrong. So he's saying, if you're going to say that the doctrine of the real presence of the Eucharist is wrong, then you have to go and say that the church screwed up really early on. And he says, then you must try to demonstrate how the witness of the church fathers is different from the early apostles. And I think that's a really good point, because a lot of us, when the doctrine of the Eucharist is often attacked, many of us have not read the church fathers, and so we don't know when we're like, wow, well, maybe Jesus was just talking in the Gospels about it being a symbol. Maybe he wasn't saying I'm real bread, or this bread is my real flesh. Maybe he was just saying it symbolically. But what we see when we read the church fathers, and this is what's really important, and that, again, this is one of the things that changed my life personally, is we see that there is absolutely none of them talking about the Eucharist as a symbol. From the very earliest generations of the church, everyone is unanimously talking about the Eucharist as being Christ's real presence, His true presence. Nothing about symbol, nothing about it being a metaphor. They're all unanimous. And so what I did was I picked quotes from each century to show and to demonstrate to my family and friends, look, this isn't something that the church decided on in like the Middle Ages. This goes back to the very beginning, and I started with a quote from Jesus, 33 A.D. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink His blood, you have no life in you. I picked one of the thousands of times in John 6 where Jesus talks about the real presence. And then I went 70 A.D., St. Paul. Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of profaning the body and blood of the Lord. He didn't say anything about symbol or metaphor. He said the body and the blood of the Lord. I have a quote from 100 AD with St. Ignatius of Antioch, a quote from 160 AD, St. Justin Martyr, where he says, "We do not receive this food as ordinary bread and as ordinary drink. It is the flesh and blood of Jesus who became flesh." Nothing about symbol, nothing about metaphor. He's saying it's really, truly Christ's flesh. I have a quote from 190 AD, St. Irenaeus of Lyon. "The earthly bread, once it has received the prayer of the Eucharist, is no longer ordinary bread." I have a quote from St. Cyprian in 250 AD, from St. Augustine in 340 AD. "This bread being Christ's body in the cup, containing his blood." Not something that reminds us of his blood, his blood. I have a quote from 725 AD, St. John Damascene. "The bread and wine themselves are changed into God's body and blood." 1150 AD, St. Hildegard of Bingen. "Let there be no doubt about this most sacred flesh." Goes on, listing quotes all the way down to Blessed Mother Teresa of Calcutta in 1985, all the way through Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict. There is a unanimous, and these are just a sampling of the church fathers and the early holy saints. There is a unanimous witness going back to Christ himself, but even in the immediate years following, through to our own day, speaking about what happens on this altar as bread and wine becoming Christ's true presence. True presence, a unanimous witness. And once we see that, the idea that it's a metaphor or that it's only Christ speaking in symbolic terms becomes sort of, easily dismissed. But many of us, again, don't have a real familiarity with the church fathers. I know I certainly didn't. And so when my faith was under attack in college and by other people in the real, when I went out into the real world, I didn't have a response to that. I didn't know how to respond to the charge, well, maybe it's just a metaphor. But when we look at the witness, the early church fathers, the saints, all the people who founded our church, we see again them saying nothing about metaphor, that it's really Christ's presence. So may we listen to them. May we let that fact change us and continue to change us and to change us into more like Him. Let it affect how we approach what we do here today, how we leave, how we interact with the world around us. May it be a cause for us to want to draw other people here as well. Because if this is Christ's true body and His true blood, then that changes everything.